Our speaker today is Sid Wiesner. I hope I've not butchered your name. Sid oversees the global technology team and manages all digital products, including the innovative mobile layer web platform. He's responsible for leading the product vision and technology strategy. Sid has a passion for building technology, for scaling organizations, and has 20 years of experience in product creation, development, and launch. He was most recently VP of Engineering at Seagate, a self-driving vehicle company that served manufacturing and logistics customers such as Amazon, Walmart, General Motors. He previously held the position of CTO, Chief Technology Officer of Wellbridge Health, which is a healthcare IT company dedicated to improving care for people with chronic diseases. Prior to Wellbridge Health, he served as a VP of Product Development for Touchdown, a company which produces hardware and software with a focus on life safety and wellness communication within senior living communities. And prior to that, Sid worked in rural Kenya for One Acre Fund, leading their technology initiatives to build scalable systems to serve farmers. Sid has a bachelor's in computer science from West Virginia University and is currently working on his master's in computer science from Georgia. A very heavy CV there. So I'm going to invite Sid to give his introduction. You're welcome, Sid.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. That was a lot. I'm happy to actually say that I finished my master's while working at MyAgro a couple of years ago. So that was a huge effort while working for full time, but really proud to continue education and then finding ways to apply the things I learned to the work I'm doing. You heard a lot there. The thing that I would emphasize maybe about my background is I don't think it was a straight journey. I studied computer science. I've always been interested in technology. But as I started working first in healthcare, then in robotics, and now much more in the nonprofit space, and especially working in Western Africa, it's been constant learning. And so a lot of the things sound really great when I look back in the rearview mirror, but at the time, really, it was about curiosity, trying something new, starting very small with an idea, and then building it up to something much bigger that I can be proud of. And so it's been a really fun journey so far, and I'm excited to have this discussion today about that.
Okay, thank you, Sid. It's quite a background you have there. I mean, it's very, very inspiring. Reading while saying out that whole description, and I'm like, okay, and it's like more is coming. It's like there's a lot more to it, and then it's all based on impact, and I feel like it's a very beautiful journey. And just like you mentioned, it may not have been a straight journey. I mean, it's never a straight journey, but we pull through, and seeing you as you are now, it indeed looks like it paid off. All the hard work paid off, and the consistency and all that. So I think we're going to learn a lot. So maybe I can now go ahead and ask you the few questions that
Please.
we had prepared and understand more of this. So, as we all know, every social impact project starts with a story. So could you share with us how your journey with MyAgro began? It's like something inspired, how you started MyAgro. It didn't just come out of the blue. Maybe there's something that, sparked it off. So could you just share with us the story of how it began?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there were two things there. The first is you mentioned I was in healthcare for roughly 10 years at a couple different companies. And then I was also working at a robotics startup, which grew into a much bigger thing. And we were doing some self-driving vehicles in warehouses and really interesting technology work. But right in between those two, I actually took a 1-year break and went when One Acre Fund, which is now a very big organization, but it was their second year of operation. And I joined there with my wife just to try it out. They didn't really have technology people. They were very early in their journey. And I went along as sort of the plus one in that. And I did really, I'll say, fairly basic things in the beginning in terms of IT setup, networks, simple databases. But I actually saw there how helpful each one of those simple interventions or simple changes actually impacted the organization. And so I left there and I went back to the robotics startup and stayed there for a while, but that stuck in my head about sometimes really simple changes, things that I honestly would have discounted at the time, really led to much bigger changes. And even some of those, I still talk to people from One Acre Fund, even some of those things that I decided and worked on in those early days now more than 10 years ago are either still in use or that core idea has been expanded. There are teams working on those things where it was just me kind of doing one-off projects. So that was really interesting to see the impact even a single person could have, and that stuck with me. And then the other part of that is I actually met Anushka Ratnayaka, who is the founder of MyAgro. I met her there. She was working in an area in Kenya. She was opening new regions for One Acre Fund. And One Acre Fund is focused on a credit model to work with farmers. And she was experimenting with a different model, a savings-led model. And she tried it there. It was like an incubator for that idea. And then the founder of that organization, Andrew, actually supported her moving to West Africa, moving to Mali, and starting this organization. And so for the first 5 years of MyAgro, the first 7 years maybe, I stayed in touch with Anushka. I provided some advice, but I really had what I thought was my full-time job and the thing I was doing that I was working on. And every year she would come back to me and have a conversation, be like, hey, I think we're ready, let's go. Maybe it's time for you to join. And roughly 5 years ago, I felt that way too. I was ready for a change. I was looking for more impact. And I think MyAgro had hit a stage in its journey where really technology would accelerate a lot of the scale, accelerate the impact, and I think do a lot of good there. And so that's when I joined. It was still really early in that journey. It was just a few people focused mostly on IT. And over the last 5 years, we've grown that to be a 35-person team focused on data and reporting, dashboards, really some machine learning and analysis. We're building some custom software that really works for people in villages offline, and then some other supporting parts of the business as well. And so it hasn't, similar to the rest of it, it hasn't been a straight path, but it really was staying connected with people I met much earlier in their journeys and then seeing really interesting things that they've done. Anushka especially, really impressive ways that she's built this organization, had such an incredible impact in West Africa and in Mali and Senegal particularly, and then joining or rejoining at a time when it made sense. I also, one thing I recognize is it worth just doing a very short brief on MyAgro and what MyAgro does?
Yes.
Yeah, so for anybody who maybe doesn't know MyAgro, the focus area is 80% of the world's poorest 2.5 billion people are farmers. And despite growing the majority of the world's food, they often are going hungry themselves. West Africa in particular, there's 60 million farmers. Huge portion of them are living on less than $2 a day. And this is one of the fastest growing regions in the world by percentage population. More than half the population is 18 or under, and it's changing dramatically. And then you add in climate change, the rainy season is changing constantly. It's becoming more shorter and more variable, and life for smallholder farmers is increasingly tenuous. And so there's a huge need to support food security and poverty reduction, especially in this area. And so MyAgro was founded with the idea of, one, this is an area that really needs help, but two, that there's this simple but sort of counterintuitive idea that poor farmers can actually save. It's just the money comes at the wrong time in the season, and they don't have a low cost, low risk way to actually save their money. And so that is the sort of the core idea behind My Agro, is providing a vehicle so farmers can save their own money, and then providing other supports around that, including, so that first thing is called layaway, and it's really a savings model. The second thing is a designed package that is climate resilient. We have agronomists on staff that are really choosing seeds, fertilizer, and other components of that package that are really suited for the areas that we're working. And we also include things like a small vegetable package. We include climate insurance, and then we include agricultural training as part of that package. And then the last leg of that is we actually deliver it right to the village, right to the farmer. And so we're doing a lot of that last mile work as well that can be really challenging or really expensive for farmers to find that. And so that's the core idea behind it. It started in Mali back in 2011. I should know that off the top of my head. And this season, we planted with over 190,000 farmers in those two countries.
Okay, that's quite something. And looking at the fact that it's based on agriculture, not very many innovations have come up and stuck, especially when it's to do with agriculture. They come up and then it's like, okay, we're offering training, we're offering, maybe a few incentives, and also convincing people to actually save off what they're making. And if it's mostly, the local farmers, and given that your case study was in Africa, I would presume that the openness towards the whole saving culture and the modernizing of the farming could have been a bit tricky, which probably you'll discuss with us later among the challenges. But now what you would like to know is what surprised you most during your journey of empowering small-scale farmers across different communities?
There have been constant things I'm learning and sort of assumptions that are being challenged. So that's such a good question. I'm trying to think of maybe just one or two. I think one that comes to mind is how important design and product design is to be successful. It's not enough. It's not enough to just have an idea and to push it. It's this mindset of design, of iteration, of listening, and then responding to the actual problems that are there, as opposed to often the problems I think I want to solve because I really like this specific technology, or I like, I'm in love with this approach. And so that's been one that a lesson, honestly, I have to continue to relearn because it's such a hard one. It's not about the technology in this case. The technology is incredibly important to making this successful and making this work. But it is really about like asking those questions and then learning from it and actually paying attention to what feedback we're getting. And so one of the bigger challenges that we're facing is what you just described, which is behavior change. It is different. There are reasonable pushback and responses that farmers have, that village chiefs have, that these village entrepreneurs who we work with, who are sort of these door-to-door salespeople, that they have. And so how do we help them? How do we support them? How do we give them really simple tools that actually help make their job easier so that they can be successful with this? And how do we design so that their success is the farmer's success and it's, My Agro's impact, which is ultimately its success. But I think the design side of it, product design, user-centered design is easy to say. I will be saying it probably for the rest of my career, but it is one of the hardest and most surprising, challenging areas to go. I don't think the technology side of it has been as challenging. There are a lot of really interesting things happening in West Africa. I think the rapid adoption of mobile money. I think the smartphone adoption is incredible. There are a lot of other related technologies that are changing faster than any place I've ever worked. I worked in robotics, but honestly, incredibly technical, but not moving as fast as you think. The adoption of things that are happening in West Africa, within a year or two, some things are just changing from a kind of a crazy idea to adoption at a fairly large scale. And so being comfortable with that kind of change is a big part of that. I think those are probably two. It is not about technology. It's much more about the mindset going into it, I think, and then supporting that.
Okay, as an emerging technologist, I'm so proud to say that as an emerging technologist, when you mentioned product design, it is something that personally I want to get into, and you mentioning that it's very important. I think it's quite a big deal that as Millennium Fellows we look at that field too, especially those that are into the technology bit of it, having a product, and then it could go out there, but it may not be used, right? Because if someone can't use it, then they're definitely not going to know how your product works and all that. And when you mentioned that technology wasn't a problem, I think I'm a bit surprised though, given that you mentioned that it started in 2011. One would think, that it's quite difficult for people to adopt to, the technology, and we know most farmers are concentrated in, like the rural parts of the countries, and then how you got to them is really what I want to understand, because I'm very sure they're concentrated in the rural parts. So could you just
Correct.
share maybe how you infiltrate and have them come on board?
Absolutely. So, yeah, by saying it's not a problem, I think what I mean is that's not the first place I focus to create change. It's not to say that there isn't a barrier there. There are absolutely barriers there, but I don't think of those being the place to create change all the time. It's happening all the time, but like I do think the core skills that if I reflect back, so I'm going to go a step back for a second. You mentioned one of the experiences which I draw on a lot now, which is in healthcare. And so I worked in two different healthcare startups that were focused on older adults and with different things happening there. One of them was in these senior communities, which are fairly common in the US. And one of the biggest challenges that those adults face is they actually are almost uprooted from their community and their family and living now in a very different community. And adults without a social connection and a social net like that, there's clear research showing that they die earlier, they're lonelier, there are a lot of health-related concerns. And so creating social connection is so critical for us. And that was a design problem, not a technology problem. There were technology problems there, but that was the core of it, was recognizing what the underlying thing was. And then there was another one that I worked on with chronic health issues, and it was a very similar thing. It was adoption of the technology was critically important. There were blood pressure cuffs to monitor and your weight and all of these other things. But the key there was finding a way that mattered to someone to change their behavior. And again, there were some very interesting technical problems there, but the core problem for the business and the impact was really around like behavior change and understanding why people would want to do something or not. And so I reflect on those because it was about simple design. It was about making technology work really well, but it was also about paying attention to what people really care about and truly value and aligning to that. And so the same thing exists with farmers. Farmers are looking for a lot of different things, but a big part of the feedback we get is the social the social network, the community is critically important. Their family is critically important. Feeding their family, sending their kids to school. There's all of these things that really matter to them. It's not, can I use this phone to sign up for this? And that's a facilitator of the thing, but not the thing itself. And so technology adoption is a barrier for us. And so the way that MyAgro has solved this was 11 years ago was a focus on this thing called a scratch card, which worked very similar to like buying phone credit. And so we would issue those, and we would now have a receipt where you could send in an SMS with a number on the back, and it would all of a sudden create the digital footprint for us to start tracking, cash flow and the receipts for these over time. With the adoption of mobile money, it's really growing tremendously, especially with COVID and some of the response there. We've shifted. So this isn't about the scratch card, even though a lot of MyAgro's early language and technology kind of discussions are about scratch cards. That's not really the thing that mattered there. It was really about the behavior of saving and finding a low cost, low risk way to do it. And so the other thing I'll maybe emphasize there is I do agree that technology has been a barrier in these villages. So connectivity has been, when we started, was much poorer than it is today. A couple months ago when I was in Senegal, every single village I went to had 3G or 4G connections. It was incredible to see. That was not the case when I started 5 years ago. And so connectivity is increasingly not the issue. Access to phones is increasingly not the issue. There are more phones in Senegal than there are people. On average, adults have 1.5 phones per person in Senegal. It's incredible, right? And so it is not access to a phone anymore that's a barrier. According to like some of the stats out there, 65% of those phones are now smartphones. And so it is not access to a smartphone that may be the barrier anymore. And so it just keeps changing every year, that some of these barriers that were technology barriers are no longer the barrier anymore. And so the thing that still it comes down to is, do I trust this organization? Do I understand what they're doing? Does it solve a problem that I have? And then how are they delivering that? And so for a lot of MyAgro, it wasn't just a direct connection to the farmer and offering an app. It was actually also making a connection to the village chief, finding a salesperson from that village who is a trusted member of that community to bridge this technology gap, because it wasn't enough that we just offered them apps for it. They also had to have a face to it and be able to trust who is, starting to, lend some of their credibility to MyAgro in that village.
With the explanation that you've just given, I think I can just put it out there for the people, the Millennium Fellows that are on this call. Most of us tend to put a barrier, especially when it comes to the technology bit. That's why I mentioned that I was surprised. I think now it's like a call to make sure that you do your research on the place that is maybe your case study, understand exactly how it's working. Because I wouldn't say that most of us actually do research, like intensive research. And now that I look at it, it's very important. When you mentioned that there's more phones than there's a very big number of phones, more than the population. I'm like, okay, is that even possible? And probably this is because the amount of knowledge that we have is limited, and maybe we need to broaden the perspective. And for the emerging technologists and Millennium Fellows on the call, I also have to maybe put it out there that I think technology shouldn't actually be the first thing that you look at. From Sid's story now, I see it in the aspect of, yes, it is a problem, but the more you look at it as the major problem, that is when the project stops. Because I've seen a number of projects that come up, and actually most of them are to do with farming, and then to do with the local community, to do with maybe the underserved. And then most of us tend to say, okay, how are they going to access this application? Why am I even making the application if they are not going to access it? So we label them in a way that we say, okay, they don't have the funds, they may not be able to use the application. And yet in real sense, it may actually not be the problem. It could even be how they use the application, because if they're able to use a smartphone and make a call, then they could probably use it to maybe save money and do all those things. So thank you very much for that, clarification, Sid. I really liked the line you wrote about how technology can be a source for good. And as Millennium Fellows, a lot of us are working on social impact through technology. So what is that one piece of advice that you could have for the Millennium Fellows that are, looking at using technology for social impact?
Yeah, that one has so many layers. The thing that jumps out at me, one of the mantras I had for the first couple years at Myagro was speeding up feedback loops and especially around impact. When I joined, a lot of it was collecting data from what was happening in field activities, and because we're on an agricultural season model, often it was like collect it for the entire season, and then there was some data analysts or people in the office doing some work on that, summarizing it, and then sharing a report to maybe the leadership team or to donors or someone else. And that was really great at some levels because we do need to report on impact. That was a big part of it. But what I found missing from that was the people closest to the work actually often didn't see that report, couldn't connect with that impact, and they really cared about it. I care about it. Everybody on my team tends to join because this is something really important and really motivating, is to understand what is my impact on this work. And I mean, this is honestly the way I've recruited people and attracted them to this team, is talking about the impact of their work. And so it is something that if you can align and discuss and share the stories of how one person's work has a direct impact, it is powerfully motivating. I feel that way. I know my team feels that way. And so the maybe more concrete way I did this is I started talking about just feedback loops. And I talked about that. Right now, we have a 1 year feedback loop, meaning an activity happens, and a year from now, we say, how good was that activity? How much impact did we have? And I think that's not particularly great for being motivating. And instead, I spent a lot of time investing in ways to push that from a year or a season to a month, and then a week, and then a day. And right now, near real time, which is someone who does an activity says, what does this mean? It means increased enrollments, and pushing those tools and those feedback loops to everybody in this, because I think we all care about impact, including the village entrepreneurs, including the farmers. What is the meaning of this? And so that was something that was a really powerful change for us. What it resulted in terms of technology and data was a stronger focus on things like data quality, automation, great data capture tools, and digitizing that, and making sure those things were built and designed well for each person in that. But it also meant making sure it wasn't just for reporting to the leadership team or to external stakeholders. It was really important to report and reflect back to everybody. And so I that also goes towards one of my things. I love to share openly what's happening and what's good and what's not, what's working and what's not, because I think the people closest to the work can then make a change there. So anyway, that to me, like the data and technology story, and thinking about where those feedback loops are, how do you shorten those cycles so that people can actually affect change and know when it's working or when it's not working, and then do something different, is a really powerful way to think about it as well.
I definitely, agree with that. The bit of feedback. We tend to have products go out there, and then I'd imagine if a product was not to the liking of the user and it took, a year to get it changed, I think it would be a problem, especially for the users. That's when you see the number of users reduce, drastically. From probably 1 million users, now you have like, a very small number. So when it comes to technology, I'll take it that, since you did computer science, maybe it was very, I'd assume you're technical, which maybe you clarify, into development and all those things. So was it all technical? Like, how could you say, maybe rate, I don't know if I can call it right, the percentage of the work that you had to do, how much of it was really technical in terms of hands-on things to do with computer science and all that involvement, or is it mostly bent towards the users and the impact and you know?
It is, so I think I heard it was cutting out a little for me, but I think I heard how much of it was computer science and technical versus maybe some of these other things. And it has changed. It's changing right now. Like I'm actually going closer to it
So
again. But
how was
um,
it on your end? Like how did you, was it mostly technical?
Yeah, in the beginning, I spent a little bit of time just trying to understand what was the right problem to solve. And so I would say that was largely not technical, but it was just asking a bunch of people, having conversations, meeting and saying, what's happening? What are you seeing? What are you observing? And trying to, you know, filter that in. And then for the first couple of years, it was largely technical work because really building the infrastructure on, noticing which are the key tools, um, I don't know what the percentage breakdown, but let's call it, it might have been 80% for the first couple years. And then over time, I've built up a team. So just because of my role, that has started to shift away from that. But so for the last 3 years, I would say, maybe 50-50 for me personally, but everybody would be different depending on their role. I have, on the team, people working 100% just in the technical realm. I tend to gravitate towards some of the business problems and trying to bridge that. And so that's what you hear me talking about, like product management skills, user-centered design skills. These are bridge kind of roles because someone has to translate what's happening in the business to maybe how do we make that happen in some technology fashion. And so I often play that role. But I've actually hired a product management team. They're doing fantastic work. And so I right now have an opportunity to shift back into a much more technical role, and I'm really excited by it. And so I will say there's not a one size fits all. It changes as the organization changes, as the team changes, and I think even at the scale we're at and the success we have, there's still so many areas where additional thinking and investment in technology and sort of product design thinking can really help move this work forward. And so I don't know, I'm in the expansive mindset. I think there's too many problems for you to realistically solve. And so how do you pick the ones that will have high impact? And I think there are many of those. And it just, sort of talking to a few people, getting a couple of those ideas, picking one and starting and going forward is the best way there. But right now, I would say I'm 50-50, and I'm going to be going more towards like 70% technical, 30% not here very shortly, sort of reshifting back into it. I don't know if I lost you there.
Yeah, hey Sid, I think we lost Lisa as her network just dropped. I know she'll be coming on pretty much immediately, but I thank you so much for that response. And we are now actually heading to the open Q&A segment of this conversation. So I just want to open it up for everyone in the room. In case you have any questions for Sid, please feel free to either raise your hand or put it in the chat box, and we'll call on you to ask. Just a few ground rules, and I know Lisa is back, so I'm going to give it back to her. When you're called upon to speak, please just introduce yourself to Sid, let him know where you're joining in from, what campus you study at, and what project you're working on, in case you're an emerging technologist. And I see a couple of hands up. Lisa, back to you if you want to lead this section. Awesome. Yeah, so I'll call on, and if you're able to turn on your video and you're asking so that you can see it too, that would be awesome. If not, that's okay. I'll begin with, I'll call on Ji Heng, and I'm sorry if I massacred your name.
Hello. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I'm at UC Berkeley campus. I'm the campus director, one of the campus directors, and my personal project is on innovative menstrual product that will be sustainable. And I was really touched by the part with the user discovery phase. And I'm just wondering, like, for farmers in West Africa, because they have like this large scale farming and because they've been doing this for generations, wouldn't they have figured out the way to make farming more productive instead of relying on outside expertise? So that's just my curiosity.
It's a great point. I don't think a lot of the training is necessarily about redoing all of what is happening there. It is access in some ways, right? So high quality seeds are actually surprisingly hard to access. And then the other thing I mentioned, I think, but maybe I skipped over it too quickly, things are rapidly changing. So we're seeing much more variable seasons in terms of rainfall. There's a long rainy period, and sometimes that actually only happens. They have something called the false rains, where maybe it rains for 2 days and then there's a long break in there again. And so there are just a lot of things changing around climate and around the environment here that are not things that have happened before and can't be, some of the ways that things were done can't be relied on. And so there is a shift to other types of crops that maybe are less familiar in these villages. So as an example, millet is a big shift that's happening here. And so going from the predominant crop of peanuts to millet is a big transformation that's happening in Senegal and some in Mali. And that's a really important one there. The other one is there's often not been cash to actually use fertilizer, but it actually is critically important, or there maybe has not been practice of using composting, but it is critically important to retain water when it does happen, especially with these variable rains. And so these are things that are responses in many ways to changing climate, and especially in felt in West Africa.
I have a follow-up. So I know this is kind of a tricky question, maybe. So for the farming practices that my agro's promoting, would it be aligned with like organic, or would it just be more traditional with the fertilizers and pesticides? Because I know that for short-term economic benefits, you might still need to use those things, but for SDGs, you might not want to use those things. So I'm just wondering about where's the balance and how are you able to, yeah.
Yeah, what you just said is spot on. It is a tough balance. Historically, most of this is chemical fertilizer, but there is a shift happening. So we're actively doing research in, one example here is we've shown that you can get over 90% of the yield for peanut crops with half of the recommended chemical fertilizer. And so there are things that we're doing tests, and we prove over a couple different seasons in controlled plots, to use less of it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sid. And thank you, Zihan. I'm going to move to the next question, and I see an amazing question here in the chat box from Christine. So I'm just going to read it really quickly. She says she'll be speaking at the Africa Youth Climate Assembly in Nairobi. So on improved land management for just agri-food management system transformation and adaptation in Africa. Our question is two questions. One, how can tech aid this, which is improved land management for agri-food management system transformation? And two, do you have any call to action for stakeholders in the agri-food systems space to achieve sustainable agri-food systems transformation in Africa, particularly in matters relating to land management?
So I'm definitely coming from a technology point of view, not necessarily an agronomist. So there's a lot that's new to me. I will express that there's a limit to maybe my understanding of agriculture and how we're doing this, and I think there are probably people better suited to answer this within my agro. I will just say though, often the things here aren't the hard technical problems. Things like tracking, visibility. Sharing feedback on, what is the land management, the state of it today, and reflecting that back to people is often shockingly useful. And so a lot of times when I'm not sure how to solve this problem, or I don't understand the problem enough, I turn to some simple visualizations and then lead to some conversations that maybe people more expert in those domains can do. So that would be one way I would say immediately that tech tends to help in areas that I will claim more ignorance than not, but I can still feel useful and get involved there. I think the call to action, I don't specifically, I think there are probably people within this, but the areas that I see continuing to be really big challenges for smallholder farmers are one side of it, which is what we're doing, but there's another side of it too, which is there are not co-ops in any big scale. There are not ways that farmers can then take their crops and then organize and turn those into other food products. And so, for example, we have a huge number of farmers that we work with who grow peanuts, and they do have extra peanuts at some point after a couple seasons, they start to build up this, but their markets tend to be local markets. And so finding ways that they have that smallholder farmers can engage in a bigger marketplace and then start to gain and move forward economically because of that, I think would be really powerful in West Africa. And I think there's a very similar situation, although maybe is a little further developed in East Africa.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Sid.
Yeah, that's not land management, but I don't know enough. I don't really know enough there to understand that space.
Yeah, Christine, if you have a follow-up question, I don't know if you're back on the call, but if you do, please feel free to raise your hand. I'll call on Andrew Stephen Boima.
Thank you, James. Hi, Sid. Thank you for those powerful insights. We're really motivated. My question will be around startup. Let's say, okay, I'm Andrew Stephen Boima. I'm currently in Kigali studying at the Africa Leadership University. I'm originally from Sierra Leone. So my project is based on social technology, and I'm just wondering where to start. Let's say you have the idea, you have your project outlined, and you know the problem you want to solve, but taking into consideration finance, registration, like registering your business, or making sure that your idea is safe and secure. Where do you think we should start? That's one question. Secondly, when you started your own business, where did you start, and would you advise us to take a different route? Thank you.
Thanks for that. So just to be clear, I haven't started my own business, but I've been employee number 2 and 3 at various startups, mostly in the technology and healthcare space. I think what you said is a common constraint for anybody starting a new initiative. There's not a lot of money. You don't have a big team. And that's both the downside, but it's actually really great because as soon as you start building that and get expectations, you often already have a direction and it's harder to steer somewhere else. And so the thing I would encourage you at that early stage is to get out of the room, get away from your computer and go talk to the people that you're planning to work with. Like, what's the expected value? What's a lightweight way that you can prototype and test a part of that idea really easily? So one of my favorite things to do with a brand new idea is go visit a farmer, or in our case, a village entrepreneur, or whoever it is that I think will be a user of this, and start asking some questions, maybe shadow them for a couple hours, see what their day looks like, see what problems they truly have. And then from that, I even just doing that a couple times, you really get a perspective on like, oh, I made this assumption, this isn't right, or this isn't ready yet, or here are some of the challenges around this. And I think that would be my biggest advice is get out of the building, go talk to a bunch of people. And that's a way to start smaller before you then commit to maybe something much bigger.
Okay, I mean, that's great. That's great. Just a quick follow-up. So what if you are in a scenario, you're going out to the community, talking to the people, within that process, let's say there's tendency for you to escape, or for someone else to start working on your idea. So, I mean, looking at that threat, what would you advise me do instead of go talking to the people first, or let me just go ahead and register the business or do something else? Let's just talk about that.
Yeah, so I will show my bias here. I think ideas are easy and cheap. I think the follow through is hard. And so I would personally advise you to competitors are great. Competitors succeeding in an area is a great thing. It means there's validation in some ways there. And so I would just embrace it and go forward. I think keeping things too close and hidden and in a small group is usually not the healthiest way to go. I will share, I just very briefly, that robotics startup I was a part of went the other way, which is we held the idea very close together. We spent almost 5 years building the first version to prove it. And then it was honestly a huge mistake. It took us more than 2 more additional years to then change it to something that the customers actually wanted. And so we lost a lot of time and energy when we really should have been, talking with them earlier, sharing it much earlier, and iterating hand in hand with them. And so that's a personal bias here, but I think the fear of competition is maybe overstated. I would embrace it, accept it, and still try and move forward there.
Wonderful questions and brilliant response, Sid. I think I'll walk away with that. The ideas are easy and cheap. The work is in the execution and getting on the ground. Thank you so much for that. I'll move on to Vincent Oma.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Mr. James, for giving me this opportunity. So my first question is about the tech with you have tech concerning the agriculture part. Like we said, like we are focusing on how it can increase the productivity of the agricultural sector, but also how can we use it to also reduce the negative impact side of it, because we can see that it's through this technology being employed in agriculture that we see the rise of cancer and such.
I think we lost Vincent Sid, but perhaps you got the gist of the question. I think just like, I guess, pondering on the ethics of ethics of tech in the agri-tech world.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I don't know that I have I do think that most things tend to have it's not all positives, not all negatives. There's some balancing act of that. And so I don't have a super crisp answer to that, which is some of that is generally, are you creating more good than not? And that's sort of the measurable impact. I will agree though that many things have a negative side of it. Technology and adoption of phones also leads to consumer waste, and there are aspects of it that are clearly not desirable, and that's a tough equation to figure out here. Is more good than harm, and I honestly don't know the answer, but I grapple with that one too.
Yeah, that's a fair response. Thank you, Sid. And I want to make sure I don't steal Lisa's thunder. Lisa, are you back in the room? Are you good to go, or should we continue?
Yep. So we have quite a number of questions. I see very many hands up, and we seem to be running out of time. I'm just going to call on one. Ahmad Imam, you have a question? Okay. Maybe I have a few questions myself too. Yeah. Ahmad, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Good afternoon, everyone. Please, I want to ask you that I know along the way you come with faced with the challenges. I want to know what motivated you to go through them, please.
Okay. Thank you, Ahmad. So maybe we can redirect the question to Sid. What exactly motivated you? This is actually in line with the question that I wanted to ask Sid. Many people tend to choose, once you're into technology, the big dream, and most technologists have the dream of going into maybe those big organizations and having a solid job in tech. So how you chose to get into, I would say, non-profit work, maybe, bent towards social impact. How has this transition impacted your life? What exactly inspired you to do this? And, do you have any regrets of any sorts?
That's a lot. I think my regrets were actually coming in my last job when at some point I recognized that the main motive of the organization I was a part of, it was wildly interesting work. It was extremely technical, but the main motivations behind it were profit. And I realized I wasn't interested or motivated that much by that. Maybe anymore. I mean, maybe that changed. But that was a sort of a reckoning. And then I went looking for organizations where I could have some impact. I will say that I do think there are right times and wrong times where I could have more or less impact. And so for me personally, where I was in that journey, I think joining on day one in a very small organization wouldn't have been that impactful, because I think a lot of times early in the formation stage of most organizations, it isn't about the technology. It is about like solving the right problem and making sure you're solving it well. I think the technology really supports, it can support that core model, but often it also supports scale, efficiency in delivering that. It might support like a very different way. Like if we were working much more directly with farmers and they were engaging with the savings platform, that's got to be a technology play. So I think finding the right time to join an organization and is really important for me. I feel very lucky that I did connect with MyAgro and stayed connected with them. I mean, personally, yes, it makes a huge difference. It is a lot less lucrative than working in the private sector. I took greater than 50% pay cut to join MyAgro, and it was worth it. I think that's a worthwhile exchange to see the impact and to see, the benefit in general to the work they're doing into farmers. And so that's a personal decision that many people will have to make, but I do think that's a very worthwhile kind of moment. And especially if you connect the work to the impact, which I talked about earlier, which I spend a lot of time doing on recruiting calls, I think that's a way to drive that kind of engagement from people. I don't really have any regrets. Like, this feels like the right place. This feels like the right kind of work in general in this space. So I'm thrilled to have made that shift. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, on my end, I'd say that it takes a bit of courage. I don't think it's actually a bit of courage, quite a huge amount of courage to put aside a sector where the money is going to come in at the end of it, and I'll be able to do anything that I want to do. But having to kick, a percentage of that and go into something which you're not sure of the returns, or you're not sure of how much of a difference it will make. I think it takes courage, and it's very inspiring, especially for us that are getting into, building projects for social impact. Maybe one last one. We're curious how you build trust with these farmers, how MyAgro went about on building trust among the small scale farmers, in order for them to trust, especially the savings solution. How did you, get them to actually trust that you are going to, do exactly what you say you will do?
Yep. This was hard. So I three quick ways. The first is there's always people who will be early adopters, and then many people will wait and see. And so we had to do a season before then a next round of people would trust that it happened, that things got delivered. And so the first year was much smaller. So you do a pilot, and then people see it, they talk about it, and it grows from there. The second one is actually, it wasn't just the farmers trusting us, it was actually even our staff. People didn't believe certain seed varieties or applications of fertilizer or seed spacing would actually work. So we had to prove it to our staff and create test plots and show them and get them engaged before they could actually feel comfortable saying it to anybody else. That was a second big one. And then the third one, I think, is finding trusted people in those spaces you're working. And if they believe in it, they will lend their credibility and authority to it. So in this case, it was, village chiefs, it was village entrepreneurs who were from that village. It was also regional government and other people involved there. And so I think those are really important parts to think about, is who else is involved in that.
Okay, so I think we're coming to the conclusion of our session. Steve, you could maybe give us a few closing remarks, what we can do.
Yeah, I sent my connection here for LinkedIn. I posted it in the chat there. Feel free to share that. I'd love to connect. I'd be happy to talk more, but I would encourage you, I think that if you've gotten the message, I would encourage you to think about how do you start and prototype and iterate. I think if there's some key skills that I would love to see anybody coming out of university with, it is this sort of design mindset or product management skills. I think those will take you really far in terms of not just being a technology person, but also someone who can think about impact and how to combine that with solving the right problems. Because I think that's actually the hardest part of this. It's not, there's tons of problems. It's problems that actually will have a more meaningful impact there. So anyway, this is phenomenal. This as a forum exists. I'd love to engage with it. I'm happy I joined here. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Sid.
Leslie.
Thank you. Sorry.
Very great. But I just want to say thank you, Sid, on behalf of everyone in the room. A wonderful, insightful session. Looking forward to staying in touch. And thank you all for joining. We have 2 webinars coming up next week, and you'll see more details on that on the portal. For now, goodbye and have a good rest of your weeks.